When we need an ambulance or other emergency vehicles, it's as easy as dialing 911. But it hasn't always been that way. Going back 50 years or so, there wasn't a 911, and there were other ways of doing it. And there were other ambulance services with not as much equipment and technology and personnel as they have now. The Butler Ambulance Service here in Butler is celebrating its 50 years in service. Dennis Bacher is the president, and Dennis is with us right now. Dennis, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Larry.
Now, your dad started this business, but even before he started the ambulance business 50 years ago, he was in something else.
Well, he was his trade was an accountant, but he also had an electronics store in Butler on East Jefferson Street, and that was where Butler Ambulance Service first started, was on East Jefferson Street.
What was it like then? What was the equipment and what was the personnel?
Well, the equipment and the personnel were very minimal. At the time we started, we had 2 ambulances. We had, there was no regulations as to what equipment was required in an ambulance, so we carried oxygen, stretcher, of course, some splinting materials, bandaging materials, and that was about it. We had our staff was, we had about 6 employees at the time, and we were able to handle all the calls that came to us. And as you said, there was no 911 back then, so people dialed our 7-digit number, and we had call takers that would take the information and dispatch the ambulances.
Now, back then, there also, as there is now, ambulance services through volunteer fire companies. If somebody wanted an ambulance, how did they know who to call?
Well, they would call who was in their local area. Back in the late 60s, we covered a very large portion of the county because a lot of the fire departments did not have ambulances. We covered into Penn Township, Oakland Township, Summit Township, north of Butler, east and west of Butler, which our area kind of shrunk down in the 70s because the fire companies then took over ambulance services. So our area reduced. However, now those fire departments have gotten out of the ambulance industry and our area has expanded.
Now, I know that you're one of the largest ambulance companies in Pennsylvania, certainly the largest in southwestern Pennsylvania. But let's talk about what the equipment is like today compared to then, and also what kind of training the personnel must have in order to be able to operate your service.
Well, the basic training for entry level into an ambulance service would be as an EMT, emergency medical technician. They go through about 500 hours of class, and they do time in the hospital for some experience. Then once they've completed the EMT program and they take their state test and pass that, then they need a couple years of experience, and then they can get into a paramedic program, which takes about a year to complete, and costs range anywhere from $1,200 to $1,400. So, but their training is much more extensive, particularly in the cardiac patients, where we'll use a cardiac monitor to watch the patients or check the patient's heart. We obtain vital signs, and we have communication with the hospital, with the emergency room department, and the care that we can give a patient today is far exceeded what we did 50 years ago.
Is it hard to find personnel these days?
It is now. Finding people want to dedicate the time to the classes, it's getting very difficult. Yes.
I understand that the American Heart Association gave you some kind of an award because of the level of service that you offer?
Yes, we received their Gold Award, which through the American Heart Association, it's a Gold STEMI Award, which the American Heart Association looks at our time frames for getting to a patient, treating them properly, and getting them to the hospital. Then the hospital takes over and if the patient's needed to get into a cath lab, they get them into a cath lab immediately.
I know it's more complicated today than it ever was because there are more and more state regulations and maybe federal regulations. What do you see in the future? How is it going to change, let's say, in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I don't see that it's, advancing in technology and skills is great. However, the payer base for ambulance services isn't keeping up with the equipment that we have to pay, keeping up with our costs for paying employees and so forth. So we have to have a little better payer rate than what we currently have.
Let's talk to some of your staff to find out specifically what they do, how they do it, and how they accomplish their goals. So Denny, thanks for having us out.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Appreciate it.
Let's meet Gene Troyan. He's the Director of Operations here at the Butler Ambulance Service. Now, Gene, you've been involved with this company for a long time. When did you start?
In 1987, I started as an EMT, working part-time while I was going to college, and never left since then.
Now, you decided to become an EMT. How did that come about? Why that kind of service rather than something else?
I ran with a volunteer fire department in East Butler, and they needed help on their ambulance. Went to EMT school. At that point in time, the EMT class was rather short. It was like a semester of college, but only going a couple days a week. And from there, I progressed on to get my paramedic, on to a supervisor, and now the director of operations.
Let's talk about the EMT program. What do you have to learn when you don't know anything about it and you go to class at BC3?
Basic medical care, emergency care, in treatment of whether it would be difficulty breathing, chest pain, a trauma from an injury. That covers all bases of your training.
Isn't that a little bit daunting, though, knowing that you have somebody's life in your hands?
It takes a certain person to do that, and not everybody is cut out to do that. We've had individuals that have tried in the past and found out that it wasn't their line of work. But for the most part, when somebody gets into it and gets through the class, they know whether that's something they want to do for a long period of time.
Gene, I understand there are changing regulations all the time. The state comes up with some, maybe locally they do as well. Is the requirement for an EMT now the way it was 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, the training's much more in depth at this point in time. Where all EMTs and paramedics are guided by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. And so they write the regulations of what care we can provide and the proper line of treatment.
How far can you go in treatment?
There's a certain line, and they feel it's the EMT that's set in stone. This is what you can do. The paramedic on an advanced care side of it, the treatment is pretty far, but when there is a point in time where they feel that you should have some medical direction, we're able to call Butler Memorial Hospital and talk to a medical command director, and they give us some guidance.
Now, what did it take for you to go from EMT to paramedic?
It's an additional class. The class is much more in depth because it's now dealing with advanced care. So there's a lot more involved, medications, cardiac monitor, IV therapy, and there's a lot of additional training. And currently the class now takes close to 15 months.
I think folks watching today might be interested in how the process works. A call comes in to Butler Ambulance Service. What location picks that up? What people are there? What are their qualifications? And where does it go from there?
In this community, we're fortunate to have the 911 system. And through Butler County 911 Center, they filter all the emergency calls. They figure out whose area that it's in. It's all computer generated. And then the dispatchers also take on information from the caller of what type of emergency and what kind of care needs to respond to that type of care. The 911 Center will then decide what service is going to respond and whether it's an emergency or non-emergency response.
There must be a way of transmitting that information from 911 to your dispatcher at Butler Ambulance simply. Is there some kind of a code system so it doesn't take a lot of extra words?
Yes, well, we get dispatched via radio. So it's a tone alert through the entire counties the same way. So we receive all of our emergency calls by radio. They also have what they, as the EMD training, and the breakdown of exactly the type of call that it is requires, a type of care.
Could you give us an example of what might be said to give you those cue words to know what the emergency is?
The 911 Center uses a system and they code it by Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. The Alpha is a non-emergency response, so that means that there's no red lights or sirens. The Bravo, Charlie, and Delta responses require a paramedic and they're an emergency lights and siren response to that incident.
So you get the call from 911 to your dispatcher at Butler Ambulance. You know exactly, or at least basically, what the problem is out there. Somebody has a heart attack or fell down or hurt themselves in an automobile accident. Do you know exactly what equipment then and what personnel to take out there?
No, those exact dispatches are a general idea of what's wrong at the incident. We usually don't find out exactly 100% until we have eyes on the patient and we're on the scene of the incident.
Let's talk about a typical visit, if there is such a thing. You have the call, you get in your ambulance and you start going. You've got an EMT aboard, you've got a paramedic on board. Tell us about what the experience might be like.
The very first thing is to find your patient and do an assessment based on your education of training of what you're assessing them and where your next level of care needs to go. We typically will take in a bag that has oxygen, able to monitor blood pressure or cardiac monitor so that we can see what type of electrical activity the heart has. We also take IV supplies if we need to start an IV, and also medications that may be required.
Now, you have lots of training, but once you get there, you're not physicians. You might need some help from a physician or some higher medical level. How do you get that at the scene?
We're able to call by phone to Butler Memorial Hospital and talk to a medical command doctor. The doctor then can lead us in the direction that we should go if we have any questions.
Is it difficult to transmit exactly what you've learned at the scene to the doctor at the hospital?
No, we're both kind of on the same level of a medical care. And so we know what information they want and what is needed to be given to them at that point in time.
So when they get the information, they know that within minutes or so you'll be coming there with that patient, so they know what to expect at the emergency room.
Yes, all patients that are transported to the hospital, even if we don't have to talk to the medical command doctor, we give a radio report of a brief scenario, what's going on, so that the emergency department staff can be prepared for us.
Now, Butler Ambulance Service has about 100 employees and about 14 or 15 vehicles. Is it difficult finding people who want to do this work?
Yes, and actually there is a nationwide shortage of paramedics and EMTs at this point in time. We don't know why it came around this way, but it's shorting nationwide.
You've been doing this for over 30 years. Have there been many, many changes for you as an individual in those 30 years?
Oh yes, the type of care changes every day. Not as much every day for us, but though they go through every year some type of revision of our protocols, and usually that's always for the better.
Well, I would imagine there's a lot of satisfaction too, and I'm sure in your mind you can think of people whose maybe life you actually saved.
Oh, absolutely. That's back to everybody that pursues this type of field decides whether at some point in time, yes, this is what they want to do for a long period of time. And that is the most rewarding part of it, is those individuals you're able to help.
Gene, good to talk to you. We want to talk to an EMT now to find out about his experience. Thanks a lot.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you.
Steve Martin is an EMT here at Butler Ambulance Service. Now, to be an EMT, I know you had to take some courses. How long ago did you take your first EMT course?
I started in the fall term at BC3 in 1986.
Was it a hard course for you?
No, not really. It was pretty much basic. I took right to it.
Why did you decide to take the course and get involved with emergency medical care?
When I was a kid, I always liked the fire trucks, the ambulances, the police cars, and I'm a victim of the Johnny and Roy Emergency Squad 51 generation, and I just took to it.
Let's talk about the equipment. Is this a typical ambulance?
Yes, this is a typical ambulance. It's licensed ALS, which provides a paramedic and an EMT. It has the heart monitor, the drug boxes, the IV equipment, plus the basic life support systems, oxygen, suction units, things like that. Everything we would need to treat somebody.
Well, you mentioned just a few items. This unit seems to be really packed. What else is in there?
Backboards, splints, trauma equipment such as bandages, IV supplies, cervical collars, longboard, certain other extrication equipment that we need to, in case the stretcher doesn't fit in somebody's home, to carry them down the steps. Pretty much that's about it.
What can you think of one or two incidents that maybe stick in your mind as something that was a really important call where you might have saved somebody's life?
I think the one that really sticks to me is the incident involving the Rottweilers attacking the 2-year-old boy back in, I think, 1990. I was there on that one.
When you got to the scene, what did you see?
Dogs running around, actually literally chewing on a 2-year-old.
What do you do about that? Because the dogs could attack you as well as the victim.
Well, they were fenced in. We couldn't get to them, and they couldn't get to us. Actually, one of our paramedics, who's no longer employed by us, Chris Jones, actually put on fire gear and took a fire extinguisher and crawled over the fence. It was the bravest thing I've ever seen. And went in with the fire extinguisher, shot the dogs with the CO2. The dogs scattered, and he grabbed the child and ran towards the fence.
What was the immediate treatment for the patient who was mauled by those dogs?
If I remember correctly, I think it was the first time they ever used the interosseous IV, in which they actually drilled into the bone marrow of the child's leg, and to get IV access, and then getting him to the helicopter as fast as we could.
Now, this sounds like the work that a physician would offer. Can an EMT or a paramedic do that?
An EMT can't, a paramedic can. We are under the direction of a physician through Butler Hospital, medic command physician. And they basically set forth our protocols that what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do.
When you get a call here at the headquarters from 911, do you really know what to expect when you get on the scene?
No, usually they give you a broad idea of what's going on, but until you get there and actually assess, you don't know what you're getting yourself into or your patient into.
Now, you've been with this ambulance service for over 30 years. Tell us about how it was in the beginning, the kind of equipment that was available, the kind of personnel that were working there, and how you went from there.
Well, when I first started with the company, we only had 4 ambulances. We only had a small area, which was Butler City, Butler Township, and a small section of Connequenessing, and we handled 911 for the residents of those areas. We had 1 crew on duty. Sometimes we had a paramedic. There was a paramedic at Butler Hospital called the Medic 1 unit, and we would call them if we needed them, and they would come out and assist us. Plus the fire departments in those days, they ran rescue, QRS, what we call quick response service. They all did it, and we had enough help, but we weren't as busy as we are now.
Now, in those days before 911, it would be patients or people who have emergencies that would call you. Was that difficult sometimes because they don't have codes to use? They have to explain what the problem is.
Actually, yeah, when I started, we always did have 911. They used to call us directly on the phone. It was a ring-down phone. You pick it up, and it would then connect directly to the 911 center, and they would tell you what you had. It's up to the 911 dispatchers to, hey, respond to such and such address. You have a male patient that's down unconscious. We don't know if he's breathing or not. Well, then you had to go there and find out what you're getting yourself into.
Now, you've got about 14 pieces of equipment here at Butler Ambulance Service. At times, I would imagine that they're all out. What happens when that occurs and 911 is looking for an ambulance?
We have very good mutual aid with the outlying ambulance services such as East Butler, Saxonburg, Slippery Rock, Harmony. There's still quite a few other ambulance services out there, and we'll call them, and they come in and assist us. We go out and assist them when they get busy.
Now, eventually it's going to be a problem because I understand it's hard for you to hire people. People are not interested in coming into this business. With the volunteer fire companies, they would have it worse because they're looking for volunteers. Where is that leading?
I don't know. That's beyond my even thought of process. It's going to get tougher. It's going to get harder. We need to, the state and local authorities and even us, we need to start figuring out how to attract people into this business and get them interested in it, where it is rewarding. You do have your days, good days, and your bad days, but for the most part, it's a good day.
Is there something you can say to somebody watching today that might induce them to start looking into the possibility of becoming an EMT?
If you're interested in helping people, this is one way of doing it. If you think you can handle it, you can handle the stress, you can handle the physical part of it. It's a good career to have. It's one of those careers where you can actually retire from now. Years ago you couldn't, but now you can. It's a start. We attract a lot of nursing students, a lot of physician's assistant students. We even had a resident that was a doctor going to medical school that used to come in on weekends and ride with us. So it's a good career to have if you're interested and if you really want to do it.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you.
You're welcome.
John Packetts is an assistant supervisor here at Butler Ambulance Service, and you're also a paramedic. Tell us about some of the trips you've taken that might give us an example of just what kind of situations you run into.
Sure. We take care of anything from a medical call, such as chest pains or non-traumatic back pain, hip pain, down to vehicle accidents, all types of incidents with sick people, people that are trapped in elevators. The sky's really the limit. We go on a lot of different things.
When you've got a situation that's really critical, obviously as an EMT or a paramedic, you're not qualified to treat some of those situations. And I know you're in close touch with the emergency room of the hospital. Tell us about how that works and maybe an example of how that worked in a specific case.
Sure. There are certain situations where there's things outside of our standard protocol that's a standing protocol that as long as we follow it, we don't have to get any guidance from anyone else. If something happens that needs us to practice outside of our protocol, we have a very good system with Butler Hospital where we can call a command line. It's a dedicated phone line. No calls can go out on it. It's always available. These doctors will answer our questions. They can give us permission to do things outside of our scope of practice if it's necessary for the well-being of the patient.
What happens if you can't get through to the hospital immediately and there's something that's really serious that's maybe above your level of training? What do you do?
Sure. So if that happens, it would be very rare. But if it did happen, we would do what was in the best interest of the patient, even if we had to go outside of our protocol slightly. But the chances of that happening are pretty slim. We can also call other hospitals. If we need to call Allegheny General or UPMC Presbyterian, we can get a command order from any command physician if necessary.
Now, isn't it difficult for the emergency room doctor to be able to prescribe something when he can't see the patient?
Yeah, and it's a lot of that comes down to them knowing us and being comfortable with us. It really depends on how well you know the doctors, depending on what answer you're going to get. A lot of them are very comfortable with a lot of us, and we have a really good working relationship. They've trained with us. They've actually trained us in certain elements, so they have a lot of confidence in our abilities to complete what they want.
Because the service you provide is so important and so specific and life-saving in so many cases, I'm sure there's some kind of an internal process where you're constantly reviewing how you're handling your cases.
Absolutely. So we have a director of CQI. His name is Bob Evans, and he reads every single one of our patient charts. Every patient that we get, no matter how severe or minute it might have been, he reads every chart for quality assurance to make sure we're doing the right care, we're documenting appropriately, so it just keeps everything status quo for us.
Well, it must be difficult because there are so many different kinds of cases out there. You can say, well, we could have done better on this one, but that may not come up again for a year or two.
Sure, and a lot of how we train with that is case reviews. We'll do a case review on a particular call that stood out, that there was maybe a lot of treatment necessary for the patient, or maybe it was just one of those patients you just don't see. And sometimes we'll bring in physicians from other facilities that may have facilitated their trauma care, and they'll come and do a case review on the outcome of the patient, what treatment we did, was it good, was it bad, just so we can learn for the future.
Well, isn't it difficult, John, to know that everything you do is being reviewed not only by yourselves, but also by different levels and the state level as well?
Yeah, it can be, but it's also a relief because you have pretty immediate feedback to know that you're doing the right thing, and it just helps you to build upon your career and make yourself a better provider.
What would be the most difficult part of your job?
The most difficult part just probably would have to be some of the things that you're required to see in this career. Just some of the things that really nobody's meant to see it, but stuff we got to put ourselves into weird situations and try to find some light in it.
How long have you been doing this?
11 years.
Why did you get into it?
Well, I started out as a volunteer fireman, and I really just kind of liked being given an opportunity to reach out to a stranger and help them and make it a career. So it was kind of a win-win.
Was it a surprise when you finally got into it after that basic training?
Yes. Yeah, it's you're definitely come out of your training program ready to be trained, not ready to practice necessarily. But it gives you a very good overview of basic human structure and anatomy, and it gives you a lot of the knowledge you need to start training to become a good EMT.
We hear about bedside manner with doctors, and they learn something about that in medical school. Where do you learn about that?
That is part of our curriculum in EMT class or paramedic class. They go over it in pretty good detail on how to deal with different types of personalities and people that are in different situations. So we do get a lot of training with that, but a lot of it is experience that you gain on the job.
But it's not only dealing with the patient, you also have to deal with the families of patients who are panicked. They want you to do more. They want to know what's happening. How do you deal with that?
It's really an acquired skill. It's something that you learn from different situations. Sometimes tasking those bystanders with a simple job that gets kind of their mind off it, and then they're also helping, so that helps them get through it. A lot of times that can buy us some time to really get down and get some work done.
As a paramedic, do you have to take some continuing education?
Absolutely, yeah. Every 2 years we're required 36 hours of continuing education training. A lot of that's provided by our service. We hold classes multiple times throughout the year on various disciplines, from our what we call alphabet soup classes, CPR, ACLS, and PALS, which are American Heart Association programs. And they're all standardized. Everybody is required to maintain them every 2 years, and then miscellaneous trainings on top of that.
So I understand that Butler Ambulance Service provides community service without charging for it. Tell us about some of those.
Sure. We have many different programs that we participate in, one of which is a Community Touch a Truck program. This program allows for children to come see our equipment, put their hands on it, and really get a good feeling for what we do day to day. And another big goal of ours is to get them comfortable with us in our uniforms, so when we do come to help them, that they're not afraid. Other programs that we do include hands-only CPR training. We typically will put those on at like a Cruisapalooza or at the Butler Fairgrounds, Butler Farm Show, and this is a quick 3 to 5 minute program for any layperson to come and learn how to do hands-only CPR, which is, according to the American Heart Association, currently the best thing to teach lay people to do. That doesn't include the respiratory aspect of it. It is simply hands-only CPR. It's a really good program for people to know. It saves a lot of lives. Some other programs, we've had the Boy Scouts come around before. They will do similar to the Touch a Truck. They come and they get to see everything. We get to teach them some basic splinting techniques, and they end up getting a badge out of that for their Boy Scouts. So,
John, thanks very much.
thank you, Larry.
Butler Ambulance Service. They've been around for 50 years in the Butler community, providing ambulance service and other medical services throughout the Butler County area. I'm Larry Berg. We'll see you next time on Faces and Places.